So hello and welcome back to Stephen Foyle. You're joined with my R170 SLK today, and that's because we're going to be talking about a question that I've asked myself a few times now and I've had to really give a bit of thought to. And that question is the R170 SLK going to be a future classic? Now, to understand how the SLK came about, we have to sort of go back a little bit in time. We have to go back to sort of the late 80s and early 90s with cars like the Toyota MR2, the Mazda MX-5, and they very much started the trend for that 90s revival of tall two-seater roadster little sports cars. Now, it took a while for the Germans to catch up on this, but they were doing concepts and they were working on cars. Obviously, Audi came out with the Mark 1 TT, BMW came out with the Z3, and Porsche came out with the Boxster. Now, although we could talk about those on totally different episodes each, all about significance to their companies, however, we're going to focus on the SLK today. So, Mercedes brought out the SLK as their own two-seater sports car, first released in 1996, and it was their spin on the two-seater sports car for the 90s. So now we have a little bit of context how the SLK actually came about. I suppose we start looking at what factors actually make a car a classic. And I suppose the first factor we could look at is innovation. So did this car offer something totally new and different? Well, it didn't really offer as what it was in its form. It was just one of many two-seater sports cars that you could buy. However, one of the features that it did offer was this Vario roof. Now, this was totally new and totally different. This was Mercedes' own system of the folding hardtop. So when the roof is up, it's more like a coupe. When the roof is folded down, it's obviously a convertible. So you get sort of the best of both worlds. Now, Mercedes weren't the first company to offer this, a folding hardtop. There were other companies that did it before. However, the SLK was the first mass-produced car to offer a system like this. So this brings us neatly to our next point then. So the design of a car. I think the design of the SLK looks quite smart. I don't think it's necessarily groundbreaking. I don't think it's offering anything massively different, but it does still look very smart and it does still look like a Mercedes. Obviously there are styling cues taken from the SLK's bigger brother, the SL, and at the time the R129 was in production, so there are a few little cues that you can see, but you can also tell that Mercedes were trying to keep up to date with the design of their cars. So another point is that you have to factor in the brand of a car. So this has the three-pointed star. It amazes me how even after 26 years and 105,000 miles, how nice this car still feels to drive, how solid it still feels, even after all that time and all that mileage. And for me, this is still, and to use an old Mercedes marketing slogan, it still feels every inch a Mercedes. And what's really important to remember about the mid-90s, the mid to late 90s, that Mercedes were really pushing into new markets. You look at the A-Class, that small hatchback, they were trying to obviously get younger buyers into the cars. Again, they were trying to get younger people into the cars with the SLK as well. You've also got to think about things like the M-Class being the first off-roader that Mercedes did, and look at how well the off-roaders have done since then. I think the GLC is currently the best-selling model that Mercedes actually offer. So it's very much of that time when Mercedes were really starting to push boundaries and go into new markets. And some people might argue now they've got too many cars, and even Mercedes themselves have sort of admitted this because they're no longer going to produce in the A-Class. I think after 2026, they've said at the moment, and they're going to go actually take a step back and do less models, but trying to do them better. I think they have overstretched themselves a little bit in recent years. But anyway, so another factor for classic car stage is how rare a car is. Now, there are two sort of schools of thought on this. The first one is, well, is it rare because it was never any good in the first place and no one ever bought one? Or is it rare because they never made that many, or not many have actually been able to be kept into classic status? Think things like the Mice Arena, the Austin Allegro, there's not many of those cars around anymore, purely because they were just an everyday car and no one ever thought to keep them. Well, although there were a lot of SLKs produced, a lot of them have become quite cheap cars and have just probably been used as little runarounds and been sort of driven into the ground. So as these cars get older, there are less and less good examples of them on the road. Now, I bought this car for £500 and it really was a bit down on its luck as such. It needed someone to come in with a bit of passion, with a bit of love, and a little bit of money as well, just to get looking smart again. And to be honest, I think this car really is good, and I think it is a really good example of the mark now. And then the final factor we're going to talk about today is accessibility. Now, this falls into two parts. How accessible is the car in terms of to buy? Well, again, there's lots of them out there. You have to be careful at those at the bottom end of the market because you can spend absolutely thousands on them doing them up. So whether you want to do that, if you can do a lot of the work yourself, might be worth it. But yeah, you really have to be careful with the cars out there. But if you keep looking long enough, and here in the UK, you can pick up a good example, probably about £2 grand. This particular car is probably worth two and a half. So I believe you can spend that money, get a good example, try and avoid lots of these sort of dodgy project cars. You will end up spending a lot on them, as with most project cars, to be honest. But yes, they're quite an accessible car. If you consider things like the Porsche Boxer, I'll use the Boxer because it's the other two-seater sports car came out of Stuttgart. Those are definitely more valuable in the UK. Again, decent one, then you're probably going to have to budget about £5,000 for that. So these are certainly more accessible in terms of actually buying one relatively cheaply. It doesn't necessarily mean they're any worse. I think they're just a very different car to the Boxster, but it's more accessible. It's a more accessible way in. Now, the other side of this is once you've actually gone out and bought one, how accessible are the parts and how easy is it to maintain? Well, the parts on this car, you do have to do a little battle with yourself over new versus used parts. The main issue with some of the new parts is the cost. I had the fan control unit go in this car, and if you wanted a new one, it was well over £200 from Mercedes direct. However, I managed to get a used one off eBay for 30, I think 30 or £40. So obviously quite a big saving there. Also, when I had the mass airflow sensor, the mass sensor go on this car, I looked around and used examples were selling for about £40 to £50, whereas a new Bosch unit was £70. So I thought actually it's not much more extra to go and actually buy the Bosch part for this car. So you really have to sort of pick your battles. Which battles do you want to go? Which one do you mind just going to the same paying the price, or do you mind hunting out a little bit on eBay and trying to get a used part? So although I love my SLK, and although I think it should become a classic one day, there are things that are against it. So first thing is that they did produce a lot of SLKs. This particular generation, the R170, they produced well over 300,000 of them. Obviously that was worldwide, but there are still a number of these cars around. They're generally cars that people have looked after generally, but as I've already mentioned, trying to find a good one is getting harder and harder. And because these cars are at such a low price here in the UK, they often can be owned by people that don't necessarily look after them, don't necessarily give them the attention that they need, and that's how they unfortunately get into the state that sometimes they get into. Now, we also have to look at the perception of cars. Unfortunately, SLK isn't perceived that well. It's a car that is very much, it's not quite a sports car, it's not quite a GT. Now, I quite like that it sits in the middle, but if you want a car for the weekend, you want a nice sports car, you probably are better off buying something like a Z3, a TT or a Boxster. They probably will drive that bit better if you want that sports car. However, if you want something that is a little bit softer, you don't mind that, the SLK is probably the best choice out of all of them. There's also a perception that this isn't a proper Mercedes because it was a cheap Mercedes. And it's the same people that say an A-Class in the Mercedes or an M-Class in the true Mercedes is not a big Grand Tour or a big coupe or a big saloon. But for me, this still feels like every inch of Mercedes. It's got that very special feel about it. So I would say that although this is a cheaper version of the big SL that produced the R129 at the time, for me, this still feels every inch of Mercedes. Now, we also have to factor in that there are a couple of quite big issues that when they do go on could cost you a lot of money. So the first is obviously the bodywork. Now, this is fairly generic and most sort of 90s cars do suffer with rust, to be honest. Obviously, the wheel arches will go and the boot lid will go round up the front here. You'll get a little bit of rust along here as well. So rust is always a big enemy of this car, but then again, it's a big enemy of quite a few other cars from this era. The other thing is the folding roof. That can also be problematic if it does go wrong. If it does go wrong, I've found from what other people said, it's either a simple cheap fix or it's quite a big expensive fix. So it's a bit of a gamble, to be honest. I was watching a gentleman from South Africa who recently bought one and the roof didn't work. He had an issue with the battery because the car had been sat around basically for ages and the battery was completely flat when he bought it. He charged it up on a charger and the roof started working, so it cost him absolutely nothing to repair the roof. So he got, I think, quite lucky on that. Now, another perception of the SLK is that the maintenance costs and the parts costs are also really high, which puts people off buying them because they know they're going to be quite expensive to actually keep on the road once they have bought them. And to be honest, that can be the case. If you try and buy a problem-free car, that's okay. Obviously, I bought this as a bit of a project and I paid £500 for this car. I've probably pumped another £2,000 into this car. So I've tried to keep it relatively within budget and tried not to spend more than the car is actually worth, which is always very hard to do. I think I've done it quite successfully. So I'm probably in this car a tiny bit more than what it's actually worth. I think I'm given the grand scheme of things, I'm not done too bad. But going back to what I already mentioned, if you look around at used parts, if you look around at new parts and just do a bit of a comparison, one advantage of them making lots of SLKs is that quite a few in the vendor that go into scrap yards to breakers yards, and there's always a plentiful supply of second-hand parts, and these can be very good usable parts as well. I purchased a second-hand fan control unit, which I already mentioned, new from Mercedes. That was £200. I think that was over £200 plus the VAT as well. I bought that for about £30 or £40 off eBay, so quite a big saving because I didn't mind going for a second-hand part. So I don't think they're as bad as they are perceived to say. Just think about when you're looking at cars like this, how many are actually on the road. Chances are there's going to be quite a few in scrap yards, in breakers yards, and you're actually going to be able to find most of the parts from them. And most of the scrap yards are fairly reputable places these days, and you can get to them quite easily to either pick up the parts or you can get them sent in if you look online on eBay, for example. So our final point against the SK Commuter Classic is this folding hardtop. Now, this was the first, I say, mass-produced car that had this folding hardtop. However, it was a bit of a fad, wasn't it, really? And by the sort of early 2010s, all those cars were sort of dying off. Now, the SLK is probably been an exception. It did go through to sort of, I think 2020 or 2021, was it, when the SLC ended production? But yes, it is a bit of a faddy thing. Even Mercedes themselves, who came up with this system, who sort of started the trend with the SLK, have sort of backed away from it now. And the latest SL, cars like the CLE, are all actual soft tops now. So let's ask the $1,001 question. Well, is the R170 SLK ever going to be a classic? Well, I think it will be a classic. I think in terms of the age, will make it a classic when these cars get a bit older. I think these will sort of fall into the category sort of like an MGB. It's an affordable, usable classic. I don't think these cars are ever going to shoot up in value. You may find, with the exception of the 32 AMG, I think those might go up in value. I think really low mileage examples, sort of sub 15, 20,000 mileage examples, will go up in value over time. Cars like this one, that's 105,000, I just think they'll be a good usable classic. So they'll be the 90s equivalent of the MGB. So that's my answer. Hopefully you agree. If you disagree, I'd love to hear your comments about your things on the SLK and what will happen in the future. Obviously, it is all a bit crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen. And quite often the classic car market is a law to itself, really. So quite why certain cars fetch as money when others, similar cars, don't, is always a bit of a mystery, to be honest. So it is a little bit of guesswork, this, but I've tried to put arguments for and against it, and I think we've come to a bit of a middle ground there. So please let me know in the comments your thoughts. Do you think this will definitely be a stone cold classic, or whether it really won't be and it will get overlooked by things like the Porsche Boxster? Please do let me know in the comments below. So that's me done for today. It's going to be goodbye from me, goodbye from the SLK, and we'll see you very soon. Goodbye.